Let's have a beautiful discussion, shall we? Okay. I believe we are live on Facebook now. Samuel. Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, depending on where you are plugged in from in the world, and whichever of our pages you are joining.
Vous êtes dans le monde. Nous sommes très heureux que vous nous rejoigniez aujourd'hui.
Substantial discussion. My name is Eunice Eleanor Klinogo, the Commonwealth Youth Council Africa and Europe representative, and I'll be serving as the moderator for today's discussion. Today, I have with me very brilliant minds from across the globe who I'll be introducing shortly. I know we are all very excited, as I am, to hear from them on today's topic for discussion, which is COVID-19 recovery, education reconfiguration, what the pandemic has taught us about our current educational modes, and a strong case for online learning. I would like to thank the leadership of the All Africa Students Union, especially the Secretary General, Mr. Peter Koji, for giving us the opportunity to discuss this pertinent and timely topic, and also to congratulate the union in their effort to mitigate the challenges COVID-19 has placed on education and truly making efforts to leaving no one behind. COVID-19 has struck our educational system with a lightning bolt speed and has shaken it to its core. The word for crisis in Chinese translates threats at a point juncture. Indeed, the world is at a point juncture, with one part leading us back to the path of business as usual, and the other part leading to new ideas and imperatives, which concentrates much on investing in a holistic education. What are the weaknesses in our educational systems that COVID-19 has exposed and heightened? And what educational model do we envisage to emerge from the COVID-19 pandemic? To get us underway in this discussion, we would have a special opening remarks by Ambassador Tim Clark, who is the board member of Gaia Education. He is the former EU ambassador, European Council head of delegation to Tanzania, Djibouti, the AU, EAC, IGAD. He has extensive work experience in different fields and he has worked across the Africa and Europe regions. We are very honored to have you join us today, Ambassador Tim Clark. You have the floor. Sorry. Ambassador Tim.
Yep.
Sorry, Ambassador Tim Clark.
Let me first of all welcome everyone to this webinar, an excellent initiative taken by the All Africa Students Union. Karibuni yote. In a sense, this webinar is itself a living demonstration and illustration of how we all have to modify our usual practices to cope with this new COVID-19 pandemic world. When I was the EU ambassador to the African Union some 15 years ago, I started every day with an African proverb, what I called African wisdom, which I sent by email to everyone in my office and to all the other European member state ambassadors. I did it for two main reasons. Firstly, to remind everyone that everything we do is steeped in African culture and practice, and we should be very mindful of this on a daily basis. And secondly, to provoke and awaken in everyone a need to lift people from their daily chores and inspire them to think out of the box. Sometimes these proverbs provoked a real dialogue throughout the day. Indeed, in the village where I live at the moment, in the Lake District, northern part of England in the UK, with a population of less than 500 people in a very rural area, every day I still send out African proverbs by WhatsApp to the whole community. I try to bring African wisdom and culture into everyone's homes. And today I've chosen two proverbs to start our discussion. One from Ghana, the home of the AASU and the nation of your Secretary General, and one from your greatest leader on this continent, Nelson Mandela. From Ghana, an army of sheep led by a lion can defeat an army of lions led by a sheep. And I'm sure Peter is a lion. And from Mandela, education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world. We live in a world of perpetual change. Some people are change makers and want to drive that change process. Others simply go with the flow. And I imagine and hope that the AASU is in the former camp. You have a vision. You have 7 key areas where you want to make a difference. But like many such organizations, you probably have virtually no human or financial resources to make that change happen. You live hand to mouth, but are desperate to succeed and to deliver real change to your members. You've been around for 48 years. You have a presence in virtually all countries in Africa. I imagine also you have very close links with other Pan-African bodies also based in Ghana, such as the Association of African Universities, that I know well and have worked with on a range of issues: climate change, sustainable development goals, and regional integration, for example. And they too are starved of resources and are desperately concerned about the impact of COVID-19 on education in Africa. Maybe some of you on this webinar have seen their impressive website on COVID-19 and have followed one or more of the whole series of webinars on the pandemic. Just a week ago, on the 18th of June, they hosted a webinar on the theme Academic Survival During COVID-19 Pandemic, Perspectives of Eminent Higher Education Leaders. The goal of the webinar was to share information from the point of view of eminent African higher education leaders on what the higher education institutions on the continent should do to cope with the virus crisis. Prior to that, they had undertaken a survey which demonstrated 5 important issues. Number 1, a deep lack of preparedness for online courses. 2, a deep digital divide. Number 3, a lack of broadband infrastructure. 4, a lack of e-learning platforms. And 5, huge challenges in handling large numbers of students online. And as a response, the AAU has taken a number of initiatives, such as issuing guidelines on adopting online and virtual education, providing information on available resources for virtual education, and organizing virtual seminars for members to help them build capacity for virtual education. This is all good stuff, and it shows a deep awareness of the challenges and proposes a range of actions to address them. Only yesterday, 2nd of July, they hosted another webinar on quality issues. They were meant to be addresses by Professor Etienne Ahili, the Secretary General of the AU, and Professor Sarah Anyang-Angbo from Cameroon, the African Union Commissioner for Human Resources, Science and Technology, who is responsible for education. I've met her. She's one of the most dynamic and energetic people I've ever come across. Sadly, they didn't join the webinar, and as I was listening, the poor presenter found her slides being hacked as she spoke. It was not a success, and I hope we today will be free from that problem. One of the reasons why I'll present no slides. My sense is that there's no real lack of awareness of the potentially devastating negative impact of COVID-19 on education in Africa, nor any lack of energy and motivation. So what can this webinar do? How can it generate the sort of solutions and answers you're looking for? And I have 4 points. Firstly, I think you should celebrate and publicize that this is actually happening. Students are masters of social media. Something done this morning can be in people's homes throughout the world by this evening. Use your skills and energy to ensure that everyone that should know, African education institutions, teachers, students, the media, politicians, parliamentarians, know of your concern and shares that vision. Make a noise. You just have to see how the Black Lives Matter movement has shaken the world and created an unstoppable change process. Taking the knee has become a worldwide symbol of oppression. Who can have thought that when the UK football season started 2 weeks ago, after 4 months in lockdown, every match started with players on both sides taking the knee, and that every player wore a Black Lives Matter shirt? It's unbelievable. Secondly, don't stop. This webinar is only the start of the awakening process. Reconfiguration of African education can't happen overnight. To succeed, you have to have the vision, the grit, and the determination to keep driving the awakening process forward. One of the glories of the modern software, whether it's Zoom or Facebook or WhatsApp or FaceTime or Skype, is that it costs virtually nothing to run. I recently heard the UN's special envoy on climate change tell the BBC radio that he'd been on a UN Zoom call with 16,000 people. My local village council now has all its meetings by Zoom. This is genuinely revolutionary. Thirdly, demonstrate African solutions for African problems. Cambridge University announced several weeks ago that all their lectures next year will be online. What are the African universities doing? I personally have been heavily interested in eco-innovation, and one story that I often repeat is of the Malawian 13-year-old, William Kamkwamba, who saved his town from famine by building a windmill out of local materials to provide water and electricity. He became famous, giving 2 TED Talks on his accomplishments. He didn't sit back and look for others to find solutions. He found them himself. He found African solutions. Fourthly, and perhaps finally, look for allies. Build partnerships. You are not alone. Only 4 days ago, the European Union set out a new strategy for Africa that looks at many of the issues that are of direct interest to you today. These will be discussed in detail at the European Union Africa Summit that is scheduled in October this year. It will build on previous summits, notably the one on youth hosted by the Ivory Coast in October 2017. There are already multi-million euro programs to address digital connectivity that were approved in December last year. New ones on digital solutions to promote the resilience of education and health systems to COVID-19 in Africa will be approved in the coming weeks. There's a wonderful Ethiopian proverb that I like. When the threads unite, they can tie down a lion. And I suspect that many organizations on the African continent are desperate to find solutions. They too are suffering the COVID-19. They too want solutions for their children, for their families, for their communities, and for their jobs. I mentioned above how the AAU has reacted in providing a lead. You probably have views on whether or not they're doing enough and whether what they propose can have any impact on your own lives and your own education. But it's a good start. One of the institutions I do voluntary work for, Gaia Education, has produced some excellent online material, as has the UK's Open University's FutureLearn, but there are many others. I strongly recommend that as a follow-up to this webinar, you actively seek those in the public and private sector who are prepared to work with you to find solutions. Define a common goal, work together to achieve it, have courage. It's not an easy task, but you crossed the first hurdle by setting up this webinar today. It seems to me you're on the right track. I wish you well and hope that all those listening to this webinar will be inspired to develop this initiative further. I will finish with two more proverbs. As they say in the Gambia, you may be disappointed if you fail, but you're doomed if you don't try. And finally, as they say in Ghana, life without battle is life without victory. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Tim Clark, for that very insightful speech. So, great. Thank you very much, Ambassador Tim Clark, for that very insightful speech. And thank you for the many African proverbs that you have shared with us today. Indeed, COVID-19 has given us the opportunities to partner more, and has also given us platforms such as these webinars or this webinar that we are having to make a huge change. We have to use them effectively in addressing and ensuring that we have the necessary change that we seek. And I would just want to quote a proverb from, not from Africa, but from China. This is coming all the way from China. And it says, the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, and the second best time is now. So now is the time to make the change and ensure that the changes that we want to see are implemented. Thank you very much. Welcome once again to all our audience. And just to remind you, this conversation or this discussion seeks to discuss the reconfiguration of education and what the pandemic has taught us about our current education modes, and also share more light on online learning. Moving straight to our panelists. Okay. Just making sure that, sorry everyone, just making sure that everyone can see me, because I think I'm having a few challenges on my end. Okay. Moving straight on to our panelists, as I mentioned earlier on, today we have joining us a set or a team of brilliant minds, which is a very global panel. And in the interest of time, I'd like them to share their thoughts briefly on the topic of discussion. I will begin with Dr. Hiligi van 't Land. Dr. Hiligi van 't Land, if you can hear me, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the All African Student Union to indeed facilitate this webinar, which actually forms part of a whole series that is much welcome on discussing the future together and from the most important perspective, the students. I would like to certainly also thank Tim Clark for his excellent opening remarks that fuel the discussion, not only today, as he said, but certainly also into the future, as we need to jointly reflect on the lessons learned and see where we get into the future. I would like to just maybe very quickly say where I speak from. The International Association of Universities is an organization that is similar to the AAU that was mentioned before, except that the association that I run is global. So we try to bring all the voices from around the world together, and that's why we're so very pleased to also hear so many different voices here today. The vision of the IAU is simple and hugely complex at the same time. Let me read it out to you because it maybe set the tone of where I would like to come into this conversation. The vision of the IAU, as defined already 70 years ago in 1950, in the wake of the Bretton Woods institutions that were created to build peace in the minds of people, is also the model that was used to create the IAU. The vision of this association is to contribute to peace and human development by promoting and enhancing the power of higher education to transform lives, to build capacity, to connect diverse peoples from all around the world, to generate and disseminate new knowledge, create insights, and find sustainable solutions to local and global challenges. And as a global associations, we want to be inclusive of all the voices from around the world and to try to defeat also any kind of competition between regions and rather maximize the opportunities of strong cooperation. So the IAU is to be inclusive, to represent the global higher education community, to advocate and advance a dynamic leadership role for higher education in society. That link to society is essential. It is to articulate the fundamental values as well and the principles that underpin education and the pursuit, the dissemination, the application of knowledge, and knowledge, as Tim Clark said very rightfully, the different knowledges from around the world, to connect them together, not one knowledge coming from one part of the world, rather to show that knowledge is something that is complex and comes with many opportunities from different parts of the world. The association leads and advocates for the development of higher education policies and practice that respect diverse perspectives, promote social responsibility, and contributes to the development of a sustainable future. The IAU is a think tank and a forum for the development of new approaches, the sharing of best practices, the undertaking of joint action. And it encourages, facilitates innovation, mutual learning, cooperation among higher education institutions around the world. We've been challenged by COVID-19 because we had a way to work together with the communities around the world by also traveling everywhere. I think we have an opportunity now to work in different ways. Where we were already doing a lot online, we have done so much more in the recent months. And it has provided us with the opportunity to rethink also how collaboration can actually be even more inclusive if we open up our doors virtually to many more voices around the world at the same time. So what we've seen is that we had to rethink the way we would work, and we had to first see why we would do that and for what purpose in the end, and how we would actually contribute to finding the right solutions for the challenges that are being faced here and everywhere. And so we started out with a global survey on the impact of COVID-19 on higher education around the world. And the report is available online. Obviously, this report was drafted and disseminated at a time where universities even complained to be served with a survey where they had so many other challenges to face. Yet it is important to have a baseline upon which to build the kind of responses that are needed to address the challenges. So despite the fact that it was a challenge in itself to respond to a global survey, we were pleased to see more than 400 universities from all world regions respond to the survey and allow us to better understand the challenges to the system, to the institution, and to the different facets of education and teaching, to learning, to research, and to community engagement. So I hope the report will be a basis to then go into a second survey in the fall to look at the medium-term impacts of COVID-19 on higher education all around the world. And in 2021, we will conduct a third one to see if we're able to learn from the lessons that we will have to draw from the current situation. So we've looked at all these different dimensions, And we've come to the same conclusions as Ambassador Tim Clark also suggested. The pandemic actually has exacerbated already existing issues and challenges, and some even pretend that nothing was really new, but yet that this pandemic has shown that our systems need to be rethought, reimagined, reconfigured in a way that it will allow to actually help develop the kind of education that is needed anywhere and everywhere to address the challenges faced. Because inequality is indeed number one of the challenges that we see. Competition is a very important one. Even in this COVID crisis, we see that people have a hard time to find the real means inside themselves to go for true collaboration and open participation. Competition remains a challenge, was a challenge in the past, and unfortunately seems to be there still. Then there is obviously the issue of access, the access not only to education from where you sit, but the access to the kind of education that you need to address the challenges that you face at the local level and to resonate them with the challenges that exist at the global level. Then there is not only the access technically to a computer, to online facilities, to broadband based access to education. There's a challenge there to access quality education, because the survey has shown that the kind of education, if at all, if education was provided and not discontinued, came with a real challenge to quality higher education. So it was very good that it was continued anywhere, that even the academic staff had the opportunity to experience and learn, but there is a real need for capacity building into the future. And it was very good to hear also, and I will not repeat what Ambassador Tim Clark said, that the AAU is providing a lot of capacity building opportunities also for staff to better teach and to better do research using online means. And then the conclusion also of the survey is that education is transformed, not only for now, but way into the future. And we have to look together at how to reboot the system to a certain point and to reconfigure it in order for it to be even more appropriate to address the challenges that we face. But we should not forget the other part, and that is research. Research needs to be embedded even more strongly so in our discussions now and into the future, so that we don't face a delay in continuing those projects that are being challenged today. So one of the big issues that we work on is internationalization, and I will stop there. And there is a big issue that could be debated in this platform as well. What happens to all those students who were traveling abroad and benefited from an education, then were repatriated home? How can they access today the kind of education that they envisaged and dreamt of for their own future, but also for the future of their families, the future of their countries, everywhere for that matter? Were it in China, you had a very beautiful Chinese motto, or in Africa, or in Europe, or in Latin America. It is very good to look at those dimensions as well, and I'm sure that the other speakers will address these issues likewise. So thank you
very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Hiliji van 't Land. Thank you for sharing with us what your organization has been doing so far in relation to mitigating the challenges of COVID-19 presents. And I'd like to mention that Dr. Hiliji van 't Land is the Secretary General of the International Association of Universities. She has for the past 2 decades worked as the association to make higher education a key driver of societal change. Thank you once again. You mentioned key issues that we'll be delving into as we progress. Thank you. Our next speaker is Dr. Riza. She is a chairperson of the Commonwealth Students Association and is also a lecturer in biomedicine in the United Kingdom. So Dr. Riza, you have first-hand experience. You actually are in the field and have first-hand experience. We'd like to hear from you briefly on your thoughts about this topic that we are discussing, and also what's your organization or what you have been doing to mitigate the challenges that are before us. You have the floor, Dr. Martha.
Thank you so much, Eunice. And thank you to the All Africa Students Union for having me on this panel. It's really amazing to be amid such brilliant speakers and brilliant activists today. So I'll give you a quick introduction of who we are at the Commonwealth Students Association. We basically unify and represent the needs and aspirations of national student councils and other student organizations in the Commonwealth. And we empower students of the Commonwealth to influence change in their education, in their systems, and in their countries, to contribute to their societies. And we amplify their voices in international platforms. We are the bridge of national student organizations and governments when they come collectively in CHOGM or like the Commonwealth Conference of Education Ministers. We bring their recommendations, their suggestions, their activism to the ministers and government bodies, who then accept the kind of recommendations that they can integrate with their policies and their declaration in the meetings. So we always aim to create an environment for student bodies and student movements to build their respective and collective capacities and freely express their needs and advocate for themselves. Now, with regards to what's happening in the current COVID-19 situation, a lot of discussion goes on as to how we plan to bounce back after COVID-19, on how we plan to go back to normal. When can this COVID pandemic be over? When is the vaccine coming out? When, basically the idea of normalcy is something that we're all craving. And I think that could be one of our shortfalls moving forward, because right now we need to think about this being the current normal, this pandemic situation that we are in, where a lot of us are not able to physically interact with each other. A meeting like this could have easily, us who has so many webinars and discussions and meetings, this could have easily been a physical meeting, but we have decided to push this onto an online platform. So things like this, it gives us an indication of what the future of education is going to be as well. We have to consider the current status quo as normal and then move forward, rather than trying to go back to what was normal pre-COVID. Now I'll give you several examples. With regards to learning in higher education, I'm a lecturer in biomedicine at the University of East Anglia at the moment, and it has been a very difficult challenge globally for every single education institute to shift overnight. And I think overall, I would say, from my understanding and my personal experience, universities, schools, higher education institutes have done a tremendous and brilliant job in shifting and rapidly transitioning into online learning overnight, within a few days, coming up with policies, coming up with tools to enable students to learn. And I did some surveys with my students personally after delivering online lectures, and if I could give some data, 72% of them actually claimed that they think that this is a sustainable platform, and this is a sustainable way, and this is a sustainable future of education, given what is happening with the COVID-19 pandemic. 95% of my students said yes, they will come for lectures like these again in future, that is online based. Now, while that is very encouraging, I think we need to also highlight the digital divide that Ambassador Tim Funk talked about. We happen to be complaining about the problems with healthcare, the problems in education that we are seeing in terms of systems and structures because of COVID-19. And I wouldn't say that the COVID-19 is what caused these problems at all. These problems and these structural and systematic deficiencies have always been there. We've just never actually paid attention to them, or we have been blindsided to them because we were focused on what was evident. The COVID-19 pandemic, the lockdown, they've actually highlighted and amplified the existing deficiencies and lackings in the systems that is existing. So say, for example, there's this assumption that everyone has access to Wi-Fi, everyone has access to internet, internet. I've even heard phrases like, even someone on the street, a person who does not have a home, they have internet access. That's the kind of impression people have. But now we're seeing that the kind of effort and activism that education activists have put in to bring children and vulnerable communities and vulnerable young people to schools, this is going in a regressive manner, because these inner city communities, these young children, these vulnerable children, they do not have access to internet. They do not have access to a television even, or they do not have access to gadgets and mobile gadgets, iPads, tablets. These seem like a very far off a dream to them. So now that they're being alienated, isolated, it is going to be a challenge to bring them back into the education system. And therefore, I think that this is something we need to take very seriously. So what we at what the CSA, in partnership with the All Africa Students Union, the European Students Union, OBESU, and the 100 Million campaign, we've come together and we are campaigning globally. We're standing together and campaigning globally to allocate 20% of their coronavirus emergency relief fund for vulnerable communities. Because most of the funding that we've seen, most of the efforts that we've seen is to bail out organizations, is to try and revive the economy. But we cannot truly move on from this crisis without bringing everyone on board. And that is why we are standing together to demand, to request, to stand in partnership, to nudge governments and decision makers to make that commitment. Because as we know, are living under $2 a day. So we can forget about, they don't have help, daily wage workers. So we've put them, I've been speaking to some friends and I've been saying, I'm in lockdown, and lockdown seems to be a luxury for many people. We're talking about lockdown mental health, people who can afford to lock down. There are some who are daily wage workers who need to go out every day to work, and they don't have that savings to survive through a lockdown period. And then poor vulnerable communities are getting COVID, or they risk of starvation and the risk of dying from starvation versus risk of dying from COVID. And that's a very unfair and a very horrible situation to be in, and something that we need to also look into. So today I'm just highlighting something that has always been overlooked. And I hope that we can talk about vulnerable children, we can talk about vulnerable communities, and what we as student leaders, youth leaders can do, the kind of pressures we can put on the government. Because, to be honest, we also have to be fair that the governments around the world have been tremendously pressurized. They have been under tremendous pressure to perform and revive their economy. But I think it's also time to look at the vulnerable children and vulnerable young people who are getting alienated in the inner city communities. So I'll leave it at this for now, so that we can continue the discussion later on. But the CSA, and along with the other student unions around the world, we're standing in solidarity. We're mobilizing youth leadership. We're mobilizing community leaders to try and activate responses from governments and funding bodies to help the vulnerable communities. I would also take this final 30 seconds to urge governments, urge decision makers to start partnering with local leadership. I do understand that governments have a hierarchical structure, and but it is important. We have seen time and time again that local leadership is what really mobilizes communities and it makes that revolutionary kind of changes. So I think it's time for governments to also invest funds in NGOs, in local leaderships, in community leadership, so that they can mobilize education within the vulnerable communities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Maisha Riza, for your speech. Indeed, there's a statement that there's a saying in Ghana that states that forward ever, backward never. And this was a statement made by the first president of the country. Indeed, we have to embrace this new normal and move forward. Thank you very much for that speech. Our next speaker is Mr. Samuel Sego, who is the president of the Graduate Students Association of Ghana. Would like to hear his thoughts or his perspectives about this topic, and also what the Graduate Students Association of Ghana has been doing so far in regard to mitigating the challenge.
Okay.
Mr. Samuel Sego, you have the...
Hello, thank you so much. I think this topic is timely, and it has come at a time where we have elected as a country to live with the virus. Now, living with the virus means that we have to change the way we do things. In our universities in Ghana, we have residential students who stay in accommodation of 4 people in a room. Living with the virus will mean that we have to decongest our on the 15th of June that schools should close down. There was no clear guidelines on the way forward for students. It took few weeks before the education minister will come and say that school will go online. But as to how the online academics will be done, there was no clear communication forward. Now, there was a rumor that we should go to TV, we should go on Zoom, we should go on radio. But really, there were no infrastructure laid down for students to really know that this is going to be implemented in this manner. So we are going to follow it in this manner. And everything was being done in a haphazard manner. Now, what this really taught us is that as a nation, we have not really developed our ICT infrastructure in such a way that every Ghanaian child or every Ghanaian student will have equal access to ICT. So we have a situation whereby nationwide we have about 40% internet coverage. And this situation really exposed how we cannot, as a country, fully adapt online learning. And for us as student leadership, this became a major problem because many students were calling on to us that even if anything at all, we should come back to school. Because first, the COVID is deadly, all right. But staying in the house too, students are still being exposed. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Can you hear me? Students are still being exposed to the virus because when you go out, the same kids who have been asked to go home because of the risk of contracting the COVID at school are in the open space without any parental control, any institutional control, and doing what they want. So they are still exposed to the virus. So for us as student leaders, what we did was to conduct a survey to know what students really want, whether to go back to school or they want to stay. And it was clear that students wanted to go back to school, but then they wanted to be guaranteed that there will be some protection. They wanted to be guaranteed that there will be some protection. So for Ghanaian students, so far, government has opened school in a phased manner, where final year students who are going to write their examination are preparing in school. This has really ensured that there is proper social distancing on campuses. Secondly, government has provided them with PPEs, that's face masks and sanitizers, and students are, in a way, being protected. But we need to do more. When are we going to ensure that every student who's supposed to come to school is in school? Because we cannot pretend that there is no problem. Students are supposed to be in school by now, but they are home and there is no proper learning going on. So how do we ensure as a nation that every student from basic school to the master's level are enjoying the full complement of education? So for us at GRASAC, what we've done is that to engage our members, we have launched a graduate research competition on COVID-19. And what this competition is supposed to do is to really devise Ghanaian solution to the COVID, where students, researchers will come up with ideas on post-COVID Ghana, how Ghana can recover from the COVID, and also how the COVID has impacted our lives as a country. And many entries have come, and students have really uncovered a number of things that have affected our economy in terms of the COVID. Now, what happened is that students have realized that the use of the third-party online learning, that is one of the things that I've seen in most of the entries that have come. The use of the third-party online learning, like Zoom and the rest, are a major challenge for our education. Most of the universities in Ghana, both private and public, do not have their own virtual learning platforms. And this is a problem. It is about time Ghanaian universities start developing their own virtual learning platforms where students, so for example, University of Ghana should have its own platform. Lagos University should have its own platform. All universities in Ghana should have their own virtual learning platform, including private universities. Then government will, through the NCT, that's the National Council for Tertiary Education, will integrate all these platforms into one national academic platform. One national academic platform where there will be standards, because the Zoom, the Hangouts, and the rest do not really ensure that standards are being maintained. So we need to have standards, and the university should have a platform that is in conformity with the standards that have been laid by the NCT. That is the challenge that students are facing, especially students of the tertiary and the post-tertiary institutions, that there are no standards. Any lecturer puts anything on WhatsApp and on Zoom and says that is my lecture notes. How do we ensure that standards are being maintained? Students are complaining. And one thing is that when there is a standard virtual learning platform, the telecommunication companies in the country can now be asked to zero-rate those virtual learning platforms. So to make it easier to zero-rate it. Now, if you're asking a telco to zero-rate
focus on a little bit in this presentation. And in the first 5 minutes, I have to tell you something from my perspective. First of all, I want to start with a topic that was also raised by Dr. Riza, which is of course a very important topic and also something we are cooperating on together with them, as she also mentioned, and that's the topic of accessibility, and especially the accessibility for vulnerable communities. Next, besides the work I do for the European Students' Union, I'm also active as a humanitarian worker on Lesbos Islands, and seeing there that many young people are still actually in many but in a different perspective. When it comes, for example, to assessment, we see that there's a lot of students that don't have their own room and a place where they can safely and isolated make their assessments and do their homework. They always had their campus to be safe and to be working and studying, and that's not always possible for a lot of people. On the other hand, of course, we also see that online education can offer a lot of possibilities for accessibility. And that there is students for whom it is actually an outcome that they don't have to come to campus, especially for example, if they
Vu
have
que
to
les
take care of people at home.
personnes, par exemple, ne sont pas d'obligation de venir à l'université. Donc,
We have to keep discussing with each other and we have to keep open and honest about. But for example, another thing that we saw that was something we've been working on a lot is the problem of housing. Since campuses closed, dorms also closed, especially international students had to leave the campuses, go home, and this also caused a lot of trouble and a lot of problems. And this is something that for in the future we really have to think about how do we create some kind of emergency scenario for this not to happen again. Then when it comes to the approach to e-learning on what's going to happen with their courses, were they going to be recognized, are they, could they go abroad, and of course all answers that also the universities could not give to them, but in many cases communication. And this is something that's always an answer in the end of a crisis. And this is also something that often goes wrong, but I want to mention it, and I want to mention it from a specific perspective also. And that's that as the European Student Union, I cannot leave this out, of course. Students really have to be the key stakeholders when discussing this kind of issues and this kind of implications. We've seen so many the past couple of months that they suddenly forgot the Students' Union for their opinion on, for example, the way they were going to do the assessment. Or they forgot to ask the students on what they thought that could be an alternative way to still achieve their learning outcomes. So I really want to bring the message across here. It's education. Students are key stakeholders, and they are also, for them, it's also in their interest if they can still pass their exams, obtain the learning outcomes, and have the best possible alternative to learning. And then another thing that's important to mention is that also online learning is very different from traditional learning online. Like for the future of online learning, a lot of more steps have to be taken for it to be really successful. And for this, I think also the traditional universities now kind of know that there's a lot of opportunities in that. And that, for example, and that would be something that I would personally be very much in favor of, is that you can do a lot of the big lectures online and then have the smaller scale education on campus. But this is all kind of things that, indeed, this was also already mentioned before. In order to develop this, we really have to cooperate. And we really have to gather all the knowledge of all the different universities to see how can we actually transform the future of education in a way that it's student-centered, using digital technology, still accessible, but without students having to be all the time on campus and just reproducing the knowledge they get from a big lecture. This can also be done, for example, online, and then the learning space can be used to really connect and interact and share a lot of knowledge. So this is really like looking beyond COVID-19 and what can we do from the things we've learned now and here. But for this, we also need a lot of support for transition students. And that's also something that has, I think, the last couple of months has been proved, is that the right support structures, supporting teachers to move online, supporting students to change their mindset and to improve their online learning skills, and also the IT services, etc. That this is really things that we really also need to support and need to invest money in if we want to make this work. But to conclude, I really want to stress one more time that especially thinking about this balance in accessibility, it's a very personal approach that is needed. It's really looking at the individual needs of all the different people that we can have in higher education. But I think if we use it rightly, And if we really put effort in this, digital learning can actually offer a lot of possibilities for accessibility of higher education.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ms. Nina De Winter. Thank you for sharing your perspective and what your organization has been doing so far. We would quickly like to hear from Ms. Sunniva Foggen Hoyska. She is the president of the Norwegian Students and Academics International Assistance Fund. Briefly, we would like to hear from Ms. Sunniva.
Yes, I'm here.
Sorry.
Yes, can you hear me? Yes,
Yes,
great.
perfect.
I would also very much like to thank the All African Students Union for hosting this webinar and also for inviting us inside to participate in it. First, I want to echo what a lot of people have said, that online learning can definitely provide a lot of opportunities, both when it comes to access, but also when it comes to the democratization of knowledge. I mean, through online learning, you could also give access to both education and to research to a lot of people who will never make it into the university. So technically, there are loads of opportunities here. But then there's also the consideration of how you do this. And I think a lot of good points have been raised here. And I think that's one of the main takebacks that we have to remember when this crisis passes, is that we actually go back and take the step back and consider which things worked, which things didn't work, and which things do we need to change in order for online learning to actually be what it is supposed to be. So the first thing I want to just echo is what a lot of people have mentioned, is the access to internet. And I think Dr. Riza said that very well. There's a very big difference between having a phone and being able to, for example, send a message on WhatsApp, and to actually be able to access digital learning. It's not the same thing. And this is also worrying because, I mean, the access to internet is also something, I mean, it's something that's based on your socioeconomic status. I mean, if you're poor, your access to internet will be more difficult than if you're rich, of course. But there's also this rural-urban divide, which in many countries is being very much sort of stronger with this pandemic, that you see very clearly that it's easier to access digital tools and digital learning if you live in a city where there's infrastructure for those kinds of things. But if you live in rural parts of the country, which a lot of people do, then you won't have this access. So I think that's also something to bear in mind, that there are loads of already potent social divides that are becoming stronger when you're in a pandemic situation. And then I also want to touch on what Samuel touched on, is that this whole going over to e-learning and digital learning has been sort of done in sort of a haphazard way. You just had to do it. It's been done really fast. And I think that we haven't really considered what that actually means for the content of education. Because one thing is that, as Nina just mentioned, you can have big lectures through Zoom, that's fine. But there's a lot of sort of this more informal parts of education that you lose when you move on to online learning. I mean, we all know how much more difficult it is to ask for the word in an online meeting than it is to actually have the word in a physical meeting. And I think that means that we also have to consider that we will lose a lot of the sort of critical discussions, a lot of this rapport between professors and students, and a lot of the critical reflections that you would normally have in education. And that's something that we should be very much worried about, because that is one of the most important tools of education, is actually critical reflection and this dialogue, which is very easily lost when you move things over to Zoom. So that's also something that I hope we can reflect on moving out of this pandemic and moving into more sort of structured forms of online learning. The thing that I want to focus on, and I want to also say a bit about what we in SAI do before I start talking about it, because in SAI we're a solidarity organization. So we work both with advocacy here in Norway, where I'm based, and we also work with development cooperation with civil society organizations in Latin America, Southern Africa, and Asia. And we work there also with quite a few student movements, which is also very nice to participate here then. And one thing that we see is that a lot of the things that normally happens to student activists, such as attacks, surveillance, and breach of rights, both on campus but also outside of campus, have not stopped despite the lockdown. So we're very also worried about the situation for student activists, for human rights activists, and the way many governments seem to be using the situation to sort of be even fiercer in their attacks on these activists. And one thing is those activists are more at risk, but it's also the general role of student movements is also being changed in this pandemic, because student movements are an extremely potent force in any society, and history has shown this. And also, I mean, just the recent years, there have been so many forceful student movements who have changed, I mean, the world. But now a lot of their tools have been taken away from them. So when you can't mobilize on the streets, it's not the same to mobilize online. And that's one of the strengths with student movements, is that they're able to be heard by the ones who don't want to hear them. But when you have to break through the sound barrier online, it's a lot more difficult to actually get, for example, governments to have to listen to you. So that's also something we need to bear in mind, that student movements are not they're not in their best capacity to do the work that they want to do. And that we also have to make sure that student movements have the tools that they need to make it through this pandemic and to be able to mobilize. And I think that this webinar and also the work done by many of my colleagues here in the student movements are doing great work when it also comes to mobilizing between unions, regionally, globally, and to share both things that are successful and things that are difficult. And then I just want to share something with you. I'm going to share it in the chat, because as I mentioned, student activists are very much at risk in this situation, and we know that this is something that happens at all times. But we've also seen in some of the countries where we have partners, for example, in Zimbabwe, where there's been horrible attacks against student activists, that there's a need to actually document these things, because you don't know the extent of it, but we know that it's extremely it's normal in many contexts. So what we in SCI have tried to do in collaboration with some of our partners is to create a monitoring tool for breaches of students' rights. So I'm going to just share the address with you in the chat, and then I hope that this is going to be sort of a collaborative tool, because in SCI we're based in Norway and we have a lot of partners around the world, but there's so much we don't know. So what we hope is that this platform can become this hub for actually sharing and documenting the breaches of students' rights that are happening across the globe, so that we can also use this both to be in solidarity between student unions and student movements, but also to hold governments accountable for the attacks student unions are experiencing. So I'm going to share that with you, and then I also just want to finally touch upon the long-term effects of this, because we've talked about sort of e-learning and access to internet, but there's also this big issue of actual access to education and the cost of education, because moving out of this pandemic, there will be a lot more poor people, there will be a lot more students who need to work in order to sustain their families, and to actually ensure that students can return to campus this fall is also going to be an extreme task for many governments, and one that they need to also be held accountable for. And we've seen lots of creative ideas already from loads of student movements who are so proactive and sort of seeing to this fall and seeing what the issues are going to be. And I just want to highlight one example from one of our partners, the ASEU, the Colombia Student Organization, in the student organization in Colombia. They have, for example, advocated for a tuition-free first semester in order to make sure that students who cannot finish exams, who cannot afford tuition because of the pandemic, will actually not fall out of education. Because we were on a good track globally to getting more students from different layers of the society into higher education, and we have to make sure that not all of that progress is lost because of this pandemic. So that's the things that I wanted to highlight. That's the student movements and the attacks that they're facing, and the lack of opportunities to mobilize, and also the long way out of this, and how we make sure that education is actually accessible to everyone also after this pandemic.
Thank you very much, Ms. Suniva, for sharing with us your perspective on the topic. Lastly, before we round up this round, we would like to hear from our last speaker, who is in the person of Ms. Jennifer Rick. She is the Executive Director for the Global Campaign for Education. Ms. Jennifer Rick, if you can hear me, you have the floor for
Thank you so much.
minutes.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here, and Thank you to everyone who has organized this webinar, and to all the speakers, and to everyone who is participating. We really want to hear from all of you. At the Global Campaign for Education US, we work on behalf of a coalition of hundreds of advocates and over 80 different organizations, big and small, civil society organizations, and we collectively work together to advocate to ensure quality, inclusive education, and the human right to education for all. So of course, the work that we do collectively is even more important now than ever before. We're part of the Global Campaign for Education, or GCE movement, which is active in over 120 countries. And of course, many of the speakers have already mentioned some of the advocacy that partners have been working on, not just during this global pandemic, but at other times as well. So I'd like to, just for this introductory component, share a few things. One of the things we're lucky to do at GCEUS, along with Light for the World and many of our partners, is to co-chair an inclusive education and early childhood focused community of practice. And we would encourage all of you to join if you have any interest. We'll share in the chat box the point of contact for our colleague, the partnership coordinator, Tom Sabella, who you can reach out to if you have an interest in joining that community of practice. But we've been also conducting research focused on leaving no child behind broadly, and several people have already mentioned, not just within tertiary education contexts, but really starting from birth all the way through lifelong learning. Inclusive education is so important and right now. The organizers for this webinar asked, what is the biggest lesson we have learned from this pandemic? And we hear time and time again from policymakers, advocates, partners, that the value of teachers and fully funding public education is now seen as truly important. Clearly, it should have been seen as important previously, but some of the highlights that we'd like to share would be around equity, making sure that children with disabilities, especially girls and any marginalized group, as well as young people that were living in an emergency setting previously, so refugees, immigrants, and then of course, in the midst of a global pandemic, we're all looking at different aspects of emergency and crisis settings. The inclusive early childhood development aspects are really important as well. So we know from UNESCO and from others, the data around how many students that were previously in school, estimates at least at the height of the school closures, over 90% of young people that would have been in school were no longer able to access school due to lockdowns, due to school closures and the like. We know that it varies depending on each local community, each country, each regional context, and we expect that this will continue, not just for the next few weeks or months, but potentially years. So together, what can we do to help make sure that especially marginalized groups receive equitable access to their full human right to quality inclusive education? So I'll just share briefly some of the things that we're doing at GCEUS, and absolutely welcome ideas and partnerships so that we can each as advocates be even more effective. So the work that we've done for 15 plus years to advocate for education for all and to build collaborative advocacy and partnerships, we know are even more important now than ever. So our thoughts are very much day and night with other advocates as we're all adapting to these new circumstances in the midst of the coronavirus outbreak and COVID-19. And we're grateful to Ambassador Clark and many of you for previously mentioning that there are really double and triple pandemics going on when we're looking at racial and cultural inequities and systemic inequities that were already in place but are now becoming even more evident for many and receiving much more coverage as well. Although we're facing challenging times with unprecedented numbers of students out of school around the world, we also see that there are opportunities to make sure that we collaborate and ideally come through this with even more inclusive education for everyone, especially for those who really need it most. So as an organization and as a network, we stand with everyone in solidarity who's being affected by this crisis. We know that the linkages between inclusive health and inclusive education and other sectors are even more critical now than ever as well. Our main concerns, of course, lie with the serious impact of this outbreak on education around the world, as well as human rights. And we know that because more students have had to suspend their schooling for an indefinite period around the world than ever before, this not only has cut them off from learning, but also vital services, school health and nutrition, child protection, other aspects that education systems would normally provide. So some of the things that we've been doing to ramp up at our small team at GCUS and then across our global partnerships is to make sure that we're sharing information even more quickly than ever before. For example, in terms of the community of practice that I just mentioned, many people, when we think about online learning, esteemed colleagues have already mentioned this, so I'll just touch on it briefly, but we know that lack of access to technology, lack of equitable access in many ways to having the time to work in a regular location. There are many aspects that are being taken for granted when we try to shift quickly to online learning platforms. So part of what we look at and from an equitable standpoint is not only making sure that everybody has that access to that technology, but that teachers have full access to the training that is needed, and that students, teachers, education support professionals, parents, community members, all can participate with policymakers as education systems are having to shift and make these changes in real time. So we're helping to promote new efforts with partners, looking at what's working. For example, many people might look at radio as an option that can reach more communities than others. However, we know that unfortunately would leave out students who are deaf or hard of hearing. Many people have also been doing research looking into what would be an option if you could have some form of safe access to online learning, if not through one cell phone, through a TV, through radio, etc. But we must make sure that everybody's safety is first and foremost, including making sure that teachers have the chance to ensure their safety and the safety for their families before communities, policymakers, countries start that process of trying to reopen schools as well. I really appreciate all of the comments that were mentioned earlier in terms of the balance that is needed here so that we don't lose students who might not go back to school ever, and that we also make sure that the students that were already out of school are very much engaged through this process. In terms of taking action, we encourage everyone to really speak out, specifically to engage with your policymakers every day. And then I'll just close this introductory component by mentioning that we know that it might be more challenging to advocate in person, but we see the silver lining, so to speak, of some of the amazing work that youth advocates are doing using online advocacy, using social media in addition to more traditional tools. And so ultimately at GCUS, we were created with the goal of making sure that children and youth do not face barriers to quality, inclusive education. And we know, especially right now, when we face those challenges, that we must work together to ensure that we build even stronger, more resilient education and human rights for all. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Jennifer Rigg. Thank you very much for sharing with us your perspectives and also what the global campaign for education has been doing so far with regards to the topic. In the interest of time, I believe our time has far been spent, but we are just delving into the topic at hand, which is COVID-19 recovery, education reconfiguration, what the pandemic has taught us about our current education modes, and a strong case for online learning. For those joining us, you are welcome. We have translators translating in the international languages that across Africa. So kindly view the comments box for these translations. And if you have any comments, if you want to share anything that pertaining to the topic or have any questions for our speakers, you could send it in, I believe, to the comments, into the comment section, and we would try and tackle these questions. Okay, thank you very much to all our panelists for sharing their perspectives on the topic and letting us in on what the organizations they work with have been doing so far. Throughout the speeches, we have realized that one thing that resonates across all the speeches that we have heard is that we had an existing learning crisis, and we were off track in meeting the SDG 4, that is on quality education. And we also know and understand that in order to envisage the future, in order to learn and progress into the future, we have to understand where we are standing, and we have to understand the challenges that we have faced, and then we can build on from there. So I would like to proceed straight into discussion, and this question is to Dr. Hildy G. Van Land. The IAU has conducted a global survey that captures data from across 4 regions of the world, and I want to know what you have learned so far that will shape the future of education. You made mention of exacerbating inequalities and other challenges, but we want to know what are the issues that we should pay critical attention to. So this question is for Dr. Hildy G. Van Land. If you are...
Yes, I was on mute, so I unmuted myself. It's a bit challenging. We have also many things to say, but I would like to maybe highlight 3 things. I think it is, there is much more to be read in the document itself, and I would be more than pleased to respond to any questions that the participants would have after this session as well, and to engage in a conversation that would be of assistance. But yes, the major points, because the question was that, what are the key issues that we need to pay critical attention to? They were raised already, but it has to be repeated. We have to pay special attention to the students, to their voice, make sure that they're not muted, silenced, or whatever. So I listened very carefully to what was said there, and we will make sure that we also include information on that on the IAU COVID-19 pages that we make available to the global higher education community and beyond. The other very important point is the point of much attention that needs to be paid to how to finance education in the short, medium, and long term. How will we do that? Because there will be so many other competing issues that governments will have to address, that they may slash out 2 things. Health and education are always at risk when recovery time is there. And even though this was a health crisis, it may become more of a challenge to an economic crisis that we face, because we believe that if the economy is good, then the rest will follow. No education, as Tim Clark said as well, using that famous phrase from Nelson Mandela, education is where we need to start, and good education is what we need to ensure. So the impacts on teaching and learning modalities, it has been said, that is where capacity building needs to be provided. And I wonder if we will be able to provide for that capacity building over the months to come, so that when September is there, we will be able to have the kind of quality higher education that we need. And that is what we should aim, though, so that we have better education. Then the other big issue of connectivity, that is a real one, and not only in Africa, in many parts of the world. So that is also where a lot of attention needs to be paid, and information needs to be shared. Also, opportunities need to be maximized. So again, the IAU has a platform where initiatives are made available. We offer a lot for free, and we hope that that is useful. But I would like to draw the attention as well to the UNESCO Global Education Coalition, where many actors providing for online opportunities have decided to offer many of these opportunities for free. it should be said and shared a lot so that people can really use those opportunities to the full. So go to the UNESCO website, go for Global Education Coalition, and you will see many opportunities that are made available for free, and that may be a solution for the many looking for solutions. Then, and third point I would like to make is the importance of the multi-stakeholder dialogues that need to take place, so that universities are not only seen as a problem where there are problems and challenges, but really see that universities continue to work at all the different levels, and that they definitely, beyond the student population that is absolutely essential to drafting the solutions for the future, universities themselves are these stakeholders that governments should connect to find the best way to draft the solutions and for the future that we need and the future that we want. Then there was one final point that I would like to highlight, which I found very interesting, is this worry that we see in our communities at all the levels. It's a worry of the students about their future of their education, but their future at large. It's the worry of the parents. It's the worry of the teachers. Many of them in the private sector have lost their jobs, don't have a salary, are not even able physically or technically to help their students through this very difficult period. But in a world where there's more and more private higher education being provided, this is a problem. We can't delve into that, but that is a worry as well. And then a worry of the professors, the researchers about their own future. And these worries request very good communication about the kind of solutions that are available. And that is where we need to communicate better. And that was one of the points that was raised, I think, by Nina de Winter, that through better communication, better sharing, better cooperation, we will be able to understand what is possible, to understand what is available, to see where opportunities can be maximized and how we can actually make sure that future international collaboration will be one of the answers to address the challenges that we face. So it's a bit generic, unfortunately. Time doesn't allow to go more into detail, but I would like to make that plea, and that is what came out very strongly also out of the global survey. We will dig deeper into that in the next edition of the survey. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Haley G. van der Land. Thank you very much for addressing that very key topic. I would like to move straight to Nina de Winter. As mentioned earlier, you made certain observations about how students should be key stakeholders and moving forward. And I want to find out from you what you think or how there can be collaborations between the educational systems or those leading the systems and students.
Yes, thank you for this question. Yeah, that's of course basically what we are working on a daily basis, like giving the students the voice to be meaningful participators in the whole education process. And I think that is a shared responsibility of the students to step up for themselves and to show the decision makers, and like on the government level, on the European level, and on the institution level, that their opinion counts, that what they say is actually super important. So I would also encourage all the students that are listening here, even though maybe the context in which I'm a student representative is easier than being a student representative in the context of many of you, and I completely realize that, I still think we should really step up for ourselves and take the opportunities we get to show that we have a voice in the answers to these global challenges. On the other hand, I also think it's just a matter of institutionalization of the student's voice. There should be and have to be rules and regulations on how to involve students in the government processes of universities, how they should be consulted on a government level. So it's also really like a message to the decision makers that you cannot just step over the student voice. There needs to be some kind of institutionalization of the student voice in the different decision making processes. And I also think it's a realization that needs to be made by the decision makers that the student voice is not something scary, or the students will not just stop you from doing what you want to do. It's like, it's this cooperation that will eventually lead to better outcomes. And I think slowly, at least in the context that I'm working in the context that we are working as the European Students' Union, you see that slowly it's moving in the right directions. But I also know that there's a world to win still, and that's really like, I would say, a message to the students: just keep fighting for it and don't stop. And that's also something that Ambassador Tim Clark already mentioned as his second point of the takeaways: don't stop and keep fighting. And I think in the end, we will be able to prove that only together we can make better decisions and better outcomes.
Thank you very much for that. We move to our next question. This question is to Ms. Sunniva Hoyska. You mentioned earlier in your statement that there has been a lot of restrictions, especially in Zimbabwe. There have been horrible attacks in Zimbabwe. I'd like to find out from you how student organization can continue to be effective. I know you already shared documents with us, and I believe which has some of these solutions, but we would like to hear from you on how student organizations can continue to be effective and efficient even under such emergencies.
Yes, thank you for addressing that. I want to just add that the tool that I've shared is more, it's a documentation website. So first thing I want to say is that I don't have the solution. I wish I had. And one thing I want to just highlight here is that speaking from a Norwegian context, I've never had to consider these attacks, which is a privilege. But many of the student unions in many other countries, such as Zimbabwe, they have plans. They're really well organized on this because they have to be in order to fight for fundamental rights that I can take for granted, such as freedom of speech and such as being able to actually advocate on campus. They have to have safe houses, strategies, so on and so forth. So I think the key to actually being able to deal with this, these oppressive regimes and this way of mobilizing our student unions, especially also under this pandemic, is actually to be well organized. And thankfully, many student unions are. But that's also one of the things that sort of, I don't know, motivates me every day, is that student movements are actually able to be well organized, to help each other, to stand in solidarity, and to actually act really quickly when stuff like this happens, and to help each other and to find safe ways to deal with friends and members who are being attacked in some way. So I think this is something also where I think collaboration between more student unions could be valuable, because we know that many student unions have too many experiences of this, but also then know how to organize in order to avoid the worst consequences. So I think it's the way that student movements are being treated also during this pandemic shows the need to actually mobilize students globally and to have networks between student unions. Yes.
Thank you very much, Ms. Sunniva, for that response. Indeed, the way forward is partnering with each other, collaborating, and standing up and speaking up for our rights. We'll move straight to Ms. Jennifer Rick. If you are online, can you give me a hi? Great, okay. So my question to you is, as we continue to find safer ways of returning to school, how do we ensure that we prevent or reduce to the barest minimum the number of dropouts that could occur? You mentioned earlier that making sure that learning continues even in the pandemic, and you have been involved in certain initiatives to continue that progress. So I just wanted to find out, how do we ensure that we prevent to the barest minimum the number of dropouts that could occur?
Thank you so much. Can you hear me all right?
Yes. Loud and clear.
Okay, fantastic. So one of the groups that we've been working with is called Education Cannot Wait, which advocates on education in emergencies helped to create back in 2016 at the World Humanitarian Summit. And they're hosted at UNICEF, but it's an array of non-governmental civil society organizations that work together to try to fill the gaps on education, especially in humanitarian settings. And I mention Education Cannot Wait, or ECW, because I think what we're working towards right now to ensure that we are not losing students in educational systems in the midst of this pandemic is so critical, but also to make sure that we're preventing the dropouts that could occur in any type of emergency setting. So a few things immediately come to mind. We know that water, sanitation, hygiene, and health within school settings is so critical, both to help us get through this global pandemic, but to ensure health and safety at any time as well. Also, clear communication, especially as we're thinking about the aspects of online and distance learning, becomes so critical. I myself have 2 children who are in a public education system that is relatively, that is a massive system. I'm pleased with the equity focus just for our 2 learners that we've seen in our household, for example. However, communication in languages, in ways to reach parents and all community members is critical no matter what the setting, so that people are not confused, both the students and the teachers, but also depending on the age of the student, of course, the parents, the caregivers, those that can help them try while they're in the midst of course, trying to earn a living and be able to keep food on the table for everyone in the household. So we know it's such a challenging time. I also want to mention, as our colleagues with NCEFA, the GCE regional entity across sub-Saharan Africa have really highlighted in their recommendations on COVID-19, that it's especially critical that any marginalized population be proactively engaged at this time. So for example, girls and young women who previously were at risk of either not being allowed to go to school or not having access to school or dropping out during adolescence are even more at risk right now of child marriage, child labor, not being allowed to go back. And then I think there was a mention that our colleague with Sai mentioned in Colombia and elsewhere about the focus on making sure that school fees are not a barrier. I think that's so important now for everyone because we also know that the economic reality is such that when school fees or only access, for example, through a for-profit educational institution as opposed to a universally free public education system, that would have been a barrier previously, but especially now in the midst of a global pandemic, that becomes even more of a barrier. So really ensuring that all of us are advocating for full public education. And then finally, in addition to what ECW, Education Cannot Wait, has been doing, the Global Partnership for Education, or GPE, is a partnership hosted at the World Bank that has been helping many countries to build stronger education systems. And of course, none of these multilateral systems are perfect by any means, but now is an even more important time for us to make sure together we're documenting lessons learned so that we can build even stronger systems that really reach all marginalized groups. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Jennifer, for your response to that question. We'll take our final panelist, Mr. Samuel Sego. Are you online?
Hello, I'm online.
Okay, thank you very much for responding. The final question goes to you. What will be some of the new roles of student organizations like GRASAG in the future of education? And it is very obvious that we will have to reinvent the ways education is administrated. Will that also call for new ways to organize and operationalize the workings of students' unions?
Okay, thank you. So, as we have already discussed, and many of the panel members have reiterated, there is a major crisis at hand, but it's also an opportunity for us. So, for students associations, you have to first understand the need of your members. GRASAG as an association really has evolved, and we have moved from physical engagement to online meetings. So for now, most of our students have a problem with data collection. Because of COVID, those who were already working on their project work and research works are unable to go out there to do their data collection, empirical survey. So we have taken students through training online on how to collect data through the internet using either SurveyMonkey or Google Forms. And it's been good so far. But the challenge is for those who have a research population who are not knowledgeable about the use of the internet. And that is really a challenge, how to collect your data and complete your research work as a graduate student. And in Ghana, we are really grappling with students having to complete their research work within the stipulated period of their program due to lack of data. The other issue is that, student leaders in Ghana will have to ensure that their universities are implementing a robust ICT policy. And this is something national government must also be interested in. A critical requirement for setting up an institution of higher learning must be that the university should have an existing ICT policy. Whether the university exists now or it's a future university that will come up, we should look at developing an ICT policy for every university. And this must be based on a standard that has been set by the National Council for Tertiary Education. This policy must set out clearly how online learning will be delivered by the university. Student leaders must be available to collate the challenges that students face with the use of ICT and online learning platforms. More online engagement with their students to understand what they are really going through. Students really have a lot of problems, especially with the use of the online learning platform that you want to adapt. But sometimes they don't know who to channel their concerns to. So student leaders, especially GRASAG, ought to make themselves available to their members to speak out to them. Now, the national government, that is, most African governments are not receptive to student voices. Sometimes they feel threatened by young people when they speak. And it's a problem. What you have observed in our situation as a country is that the government is even trying to muffle the voices of the students in the country by the introduction of what they call the Public University Bill, where student representatives on university councils are being reduced so that the voices of the students will be eliminated. But then students are not a threat to government. Students are collaborators. And when we speak, government should be able to listen to us and understand that we are one of the major stakeholders in the university. And without students, universities are not in existence. So these are some of the issues that we have identified with the future of education. How do we ensure that student voices are not muffled or even booted out completely? And the last thing is that education is holistic. It's not just about learning and writing examination. It's about experience, building network, getting to meet people. Because at the end of the day, it's the same people that we meet in the classrooms that we end up at the international or national stage with. Now, if we are going to do strictly online learning, how do we ensure that all the students are really together? We are sharing culture, we are sharing experiences, and really having a holistic academic experience. And that's also a challenge. So going forward, I believe it's about time we become innovative and know how we will network more through engagements like this. I've gotten to meet you, Eunice, I've heard about you. And we have to do more engagements so that we will have more international connection and networking.
Thank you very much, Mr. Samuel Sego, for that response. My question goes to Ambassador Tim Clark. Thank you very much for staying with us through this period. Hello, Ambassador Tim Clark. Okay, yes.
Yep.
So my question goes to you. This question goes to you. So in a world where education is now a mouse click away, what really is the role of educators?
Can I, well, I can ask that question if you like, but I wanted to make some comments on the discussion so far. It's up to you.
Yeah, I think we have a few minutes. You can quickly address.
I mean, I basically wanted to say that I've been hugely impressed by the quality of the interventions and indeed your brilliance in keeping this technical debate going. You could give some lessons to your the University Association. I simply wanted to say that perhaps the thing which I've lacked from the discussion and which I was hoping to provoke in a way is what you and your own association, the All African Students Union, what your agenda is and what are you seeking to achieve and what are the things that you think you should focus on, because I've read your vision, I've read things, and I sense that you have a marvelous opportunity here to mobilize your network around this particular debate. I'm involved in another discussion at the moment with something called Ubiquity University, which is based in the Netherlands, it's called Humanity Rising. And it's about the way in which this crisis is creating an environment for a lot of out-of-the-box thinking, rethinking the unthinkable, about the nature of vulnerability, our attitude to the wider world, vulnerability in its wider sense, what society has missed. And the sort of question that you've just posed to me about educators is a very central one. What sort of education should we be giving now in the current times? Is the education model, which was the subject of the debate, is it the right model? And why is it that so many people miss out on formal education? Are the right sort of messages being given? And that involved that debate which I'm engaged in there is throwing all these questions onto the table. There is no single right solution. I think the whole of the world is looking at the need to rethink the way we do business and using the tools like the virtual technology we have in front of us to reach out to people. And there are, of course, barriers, and we've talked about that in this debate. But the thing which I think was very exciting, one of the most exciting interventions for me was from Samuel, because he said that within his own association, he has started to raise questions. Students themselves are mobilizing about the problems that they themselves are facing and are seeking solutions. He even mentioned a competition to find solutions. I think that's a really healthy thing to do. And I can imagine if in 54 countries in Africa, every single students' union was asking the same questions and got support from some of the organizations you've managed to mobilize around this call, it would be a fantastically enriching experience for everyone. And of course, I understand the dangers, the problems of certain governments not respecting democratic rights. When I was a student 50 years ago, I was a campaigner. I was a campaigner on environmental issues, on human rights issues, and my telephone was being listened into by the UK government. So that's 50 years ago, and it's worse in Africa, I assure you, and I've managed human rights programs in Africa before. I know that problem. But for me, what you've done in this discussion is raise all sorts of issues, and I'm willing to help in that process if it's of any use as a sort of volunteer working pro bono with you, is to try to see whether you can find one or two really good examples where you have found a solution, you've mobilized the groups in the different countries involved, and the students are showing the way, because actually that's what's needed. You are the people, you are the future actually, and we all know that, we talk about it, but you're the people on the front line. So I would really encourage you to to follow up this initiative and use your skills and networks to start that discussion on a much wider basis, and put out on paper what you think as the All African Students Union, your policy should be on this. Find allies, find partners, and make it happen. So I'm excited to be part of this process. I haven't really answered your question. All I'm saying is don't stop. I mean, there are not enough people listening to the call, for one thing. And I think you should make every effort you can to, as I said on my first point, I had 4 points. My first point is make a noise. You know, don't simply stand back and wait for others to decide things for you. Take it to the next stage. But thank you anyway for allowing me to participate in this discussion.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Tim Clark, for that thought-provoking comment. And it is really true, like you mentioned, that we the youth are the future. I beg to differ with that. I believe we the youth are the present and the future. We realize that a lot of young people are doing so much. There have been a lot of innovative ideas and solutions to the challenges that we are facing currently from young people. So it is really time that young people must be given that voice. Young people, there are cases where young people are being put on the table, as people might say, but then are they really listening to our voices? I think what we have learned so far, what COVID-19 has taught us, is that every voice matters, and we must listen to everyone in as much as wherever their backgrounds or wherever they are coming from. People have solutions. The solutions are out there, and people have solutions. We just have to listen. We just have to listen and key into each and every one, because the solutions are in us. What we are looking for is in us, and we all have the solutions to the problems we are facing, and especially young people who have the innovative ideas. So how best can young people work with organizations? I believe ASU is doing a very great job. One, they are organizing these webinar series, and they are collating a lot of information that will feed into documents that will be shared across to policymakers. They also have certain campaigns. They are also advocating strongly, have certain campaigns such as the Girls Return to School campaign, just to get young girls going back to school even after COVID. We realize that in Africa there are a lot of issues, like Dr. Hiliji Vance Land mentioned. There have been exacerbating inequalities. There are girls that are facing teenage pregnancies. There are girls with there's a lot of gender-based violence cases nowadays. So how really do we get these young girls back into school? And even beforehand, like I mentioned earlier, there were learning crises that we realized even in Africa, where most of the countries have implemented free education. We realized that we're not in schools. So how do we really look at that question? How do we really tackle the question from the point where we try to understand what really went wrong, and then we move on to the future? So thank you very much, Ambassador Tim Clark, for those. We have utilized our time, but before we round up this session, there's a final question that is to all panelists, and the question has to do with what has your organization done to engage the learning of vulnerable students who are deaf and dumb? I believe this question is to all panelists. So if anyone wants to go for it, this will be our final question for the
Sure. Yeah. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay, great. And I put it an answer in the Q&A box, but I'm not sure if everybody's able to access it. I just wanted to mention specifically one of our partners that spoke at the last Inclusive Education Community of Practice meeting that we had, where we talked about the Global Education Monitoring Report for 2020 coming out of UNESCO, which focuses on inclusion. We heard from the president of an association that especially focuses on engaging people with intellectual disabilities, as well as their families, their communities. And I included the link in the Q&A box but I can add it to the chat box if that makes it a little more accessible to everyone. So Inclusion International is also doing a COVID-19 specific webinar series, and they have all sorts of resources specifically on engaging learners with intellectual disabilities in these challenging times. But it absolutely is difficult. And then my colleagues at USAID, especially Mr. Joshua Joseph, has been doing fantastic research and engagement around the globe on especially working with on inclusive education across the board, but also from his personal and professional perspective, people who are deaf or hard of hearing. And EduLinks is the resource there. I'll pull that up as well to share for the report. That has fantastic work and ideas on that front. But we would really love to hear from all of you as to what you think is working in real time, given limitations on technology, and given that there might not have been the legal human rights structures previously in place to make sure that learners with disabilities were receiving fully inclusive education, which we battle as advocates in all communities and all countries. There are a few challenges that are that just launched as well, along with that Global Education Monitoring Report, and I'm happy to share that with the organizers of this webinar as well. One that just came forward is from AusAid, from Australia Aid, World Vision International, USAID, and others, focused on encouraging people to do even more research and engagement at local level on what's working in terms of ICT and inclusive education. So I'll share those resources, and hopefully that's just some initial food for thought, but we welcome other ideas.
Thank you very much, Ms. Jennifer Rick, for sharing what your organization and others are doing in this regard. Ambassador Tim Clark.
Yeah, I can mention something which I was rather proud of when I was the European Union ambassador in Ethiopia. I was especially interested in people with disabilities and deaf and dumb schools, and organized with a brilliant artist a massive artwork which was done along a road, an important road in Addis Ababa, which was a blank white wall for about 300 meters. And we engaged with the school to invite the children to do artwork expressing their views on life and humanity on the wall. And we had a training program with an art teacher two art teachers who are Ethiopian, and a week was spent encouraging them to design on this public space in the middle of Addis Ababa on a wall their view, their image of what they felt about themselves and people around them. It was one of the most moving presentations I've ever seen. It was opened formally by the mayor of Addis Ababa at that time. And you have to remember at that time, Ethiopia was a very, very difficult place to live. But the students themselves got a massive amount out of it. Probably for the first time, they were the star of the show, and their own views and the way they expressed their lives through art was just an amazing experience for us all. Yeah, so that's my personal experience.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Sinclair, for sharing that creative innovation by young people. Yes, Dr. Hilly Jivansland, please, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you. I would like to maybe conclude by offering support from the IAU. The International Association of Universities historically works more at the leadership level. So we would like to invite the leadership of the student associations to work with us more closely, also in identifying and working and crafting along those lines, also said by, as alluded to by you, Tim Clark, that we would be very pleased to work with you on the development of the solutions that you would see in the different parts of the world, or otherwise to give you the floor in the IAU webinar series that we started in April and that will continue until the end of 2020 and to 2021 in the webinars, because I think that And maybe one of the issues with participation rates being low is very sadly so because there is something of a non-connect with other dialogues or platforms. Even though you try to bring in many different people, there's something about the fact that this should have been listened into by many, many more people. So we will make the live stream available through the IAU platform, and that's one thing that we can do. Second, we will invite the student organizations to help shape the second edition of the global survey on the impact of COVID-19 on higher education. Same for the third one in 2021. So we'll reach out to you to help us shape the questions so they respond to the real issues that are at stake. And then the third thing is that we have a platform that we have made available online, which also is part of the UNESCO Global Education Coalition, where we showcase what is happening. So I had a private chat with Suniva quickly. The platform that you have been working on, we will put there, but we can put other initiatives there. And please send our way what we can share, because that's the very aim. So just concluding with 3 options for engagement, inviting you as well to speak into future webinars on the future of higher education more strongly. Next week, we have Robert Napier from the European Student Union to speak, but I will get back to you, Eunice and Samuel and the others to also speak to the future webinars that we will hold on those issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Vijivantanan, for sharing those very key innovations with us as well. I believe there are some attendees who would like to ask some questions, so I'm going to give time. I know we are far behind time, but we're going to give some time for the attendees to address just in the space of 10 minutes. Okay. So from Autumn, Justin, you have the floor. Hello, Justin. Justin, can you hear me? Okay, I believe we lost Justin there. Are there any other attendees that would like to ask our panelists some questions? Okay. As we wait for the attendees, I would quickly want us to wrap up this discussion. So to all the panelists, I would like to know in one word, what you think the future of education looks like in one word, just in one word.
Hello. Hello.
Hi, Justin.
This is Samuel.
Samuel Sego, sorry.
Yeah.
Samuel, you have.
Yeah. You said one word.
In one word,
but
just one.
To come to the one word, the question on the blind, deaf and dumb students. Yeah, I think we have neglected them in Ghana. Our online learning platform did not make room for such students. So far, nothing has been done in terms of solution to get them included in the online learning experience. So for most of them, they had to go back to school to do physical learning on campus. That is by also ensuring social distancing. But going forward, I think our education should be more inclusive. That is where we need a homemade, institutional, specific online learning platform where there will be a section for blind, deaf, and dumb students. Using Zoom does not really allow you to do all those maneuvers. But if we have a specific institutional made online learning platforms, then we'll be able to integrate all these features in it to make it accessible to students who have certain impairment. So the future of our education should be inclusive. That is the future. It should be more inclusive than it is now.
Mm-hmm. And that is your one word.
Yeah, it should be inclusive.
The future of education should be inclusive, making sure that no one is indeed left behind. We keep saying and stressing on this, but as we have realized, there are a lot of people that are being left behind. So for Mr. Samuel Sego, the future of education should be inclusive. Okay. There are two attendees with questions. For Faith William, if you can hear me, Justin Otum, if you can hear me. If not, I think we can wrap up this session, this discussion. It's been a very insightful, very thought-provoking. I believe I have learned so much. And I believe
Can you hear me now?
Hi, Justin.
Okay, my name is Justin Otome, and I'm a Nigerian, actually. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, please.
Okay, I want to say, first of all, thank you for this platform and this opportunity. And secondly, I want to say that we should have a platform. We should be able to connect so that we don't just leave this place and we can't reach ourselves again. One of the fallouts of this meeting or this webinar will be that we're able to follow up on some of the things we have discussed. As a student leader, I led over 45,000 students in my days as a master's student abroad, non-Stocky zone. As you may know, the National Association of Nigerian Students is one of the biggest student bodies in the continent.
And sorry to cut in, but you have 1 minute to summarize your question.
Okay. I already wrote in my question. I'm just giving this as a contribution. Okay, but to repeat it, I was going to ask, or I was asking, the role of ASU, the Commonwealth Youth Council, and the levels of collaborations with governments of Africa as a way towards ensuring that some of these our concerns are addressed and implemented. Because every now and then we meet, we discuss, and it's still the same story. I think we must get to a point where we begin to engage governments and other organizations to see that our concerns are addressed and implemented.
Okay, thank you very much, Justin, for that.
Thank you very much.
Sorry. Faith, if you can hear me, you have the floor. Okay. So seeing as Faith, I don't think Faith will be joining us. Okay, so in one word, I believe for Mr. Samuel Sego, it was inclusiveness. For Nina, it was student-centered. Ambassador Tim Clark, can you give us your one word for the future of education?
Bumpy.
Sorry?
Bumpy.
Bumpy.
Yes. Very rocky indeed.
Interesting. Okay. Well, Ambassador Tim Clark, it's bumpy. For Dr. Healy G. Van Land.
Radically innovative.
Okay. These are interesting words coming up. Because of lack of time, we can't delve into more, but these are very interesting words coming up. Miss Jennifer Ray, your one word for the future of education.
Thank you so much. I agree that it must be inclusive.
Inclusive as well. Okay. So I believe we have had a very interesting, very insightful discussion, very thought-provoking, and like our attendee mentioned earlier, this is something that we have to keep on, and this is something that has resonated throughout the conversation. We have to keep the fire burning. We have to keep asking critical questions. We have to keep asking and seeking out what the new normal is, and also fostering more partnerships, more collaborations among each other. And I am Eunice Eleanor Klinogo.